On this day in 1661, yachting began in England, with King Charles II beating his brother James in a yachting race. In 1768, here in the United States, English troops landed under General Gage at Boston. They play a critical part in the Revolution, and shot heard around the world in a few years. In 1800, on October 1st, Spain ceded Louisiana to France in a secret treaty. And there was a treaty with the Winnebago Indians in 1837 between the United States and them. A cyclone hit Calcutta, India on this day during the American Civil War in 1864, and 70,000 people were killed. Karl Marx published Das Kapital in London in 1867 on this day, and the first postcards were issued in Vienna on this day in 1869. John Philip Sousa became the new director of the U.S. Marine Corps Band on this day in 1880, and I do have a book signed by Sousa, so we'll try to pass these around if we can. I remember when the Marine Corps Band played in the Pro Tabernacle. Was anyone else there but me? That's been years ago, but that was quite an event. Special delivery mail service began in the U.S. on this date in 1885, and the U.S. Mint at Carson City, Nevada closed in 1886 on this date. National Geographic issued their first magazine on October 1st of 1888. I sure love to own one of those. Very rare now. I think the earliest National Geographic I've got is dated in 1906. The third worst hurricane in U.S. history occurred on this day in Mississippi, killing 1,800 people in 1893. In 1903, the first World Series began between the Pittsburgh Pirates and the American Pilgrims, later known as the Red Sox. The Plaza Hotel opened in 1907 in New York on this day. And Henry Ford introduced the Model T on this day in 1908. I've brought Henry Ford things before. I have a little book. It's a little gentle to pass around, but he gave this to his chauffeur, and I think I passed around once before. It's the complete sayings of Jesus, and it's actually signed by Henry Ford on the inside of the cover. He gave this to his chauffeur, and I will pass around. One thing I haven't passed around before is the photograph between the photograph of Henry Ford and his chauffeur. You can really see who William Donaldson was. And then there was a World Series rematch in 1930 and 31 between the A's and the Cards, and the A's won both times under Connie Mack. Generalissimo Francisco Franco established the state of Spain on this day in 1936, and in 1938, Adolf Hitler of Germany annexed the Sudetenland, which included 1/3 of Czechoslovakia, on October 1st of 38 as a precursor to invading Poland the next year and setting off the war, Kristallnacht and all that. In 1939, Churchill famously called the Soviets a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. That's when he stated that. He also later, as you know, at a much later date after the war, called at Fulton, Missouri, said that there was an Iron Curtain now coming around part of the world, speaking of the Soviet Empire at the time. In 1942 on this date, something that us as kids enjoyed, maybe some of our kids too, was the first Golden Book came out. This is one on Lassie. It came out in 57. And those were a lot of fun. In fact, my youngest daughter that has a set of twins wanted to get a set of those, and I keep giving her new ones. You know, I think there's several hundred of them out, and she's probably got over 100 of them now. But they're good little books for kids even today. We're reading to children. In 1943, or rather in 42, one thing I missed, the Bell P-59 Air Comet fighter, the first U.S. jet, made its maiden flight. That was during World War II. In 1943, Averell Harriman on this date was named the U.S. Ambassador to Moscow. He was still the ambassador in the 60s. And in 1943, Allied forces captured Naples during World War II on this date. In 1946, 12 war criminals were sentenced to death at Nuremberg. And on this date in 47, the first helicopter airmail and express service began. The Honeymooners, one of my favorite TV shows, started on this date with Jackie Gleason and Art Carney and the others in 1955. Roger Maris we mentioned last time, but it was on this date that he hit his 61st home run and beat Babe Ruth's all-time record, even though it was a little longer season to do it. It was a home run off Tracy Stollard was the pitcher. The Lucy Show began on this date in 1962, and Johnny Carson hosted his first Tonight Show on October 1st of 1962. His first guest was Joan Crawford. Could have brought things of these people, but I didn't have an extra day to dig through everything to find them. So maybe sometime I can share some things. James Meredith became the first black at the University of Mississippi in '62 on this date. And Brian Epstein signed a contract to manage the Beatles on this date through 1977. Streisand, Barbra Streisand from Brooklyn High School, graduate, Jewish. Incidentally, she was in the same class, grew up with Neil Diamond. I don't know how many of you knew that. Kind of an interesting thing. But Streisand signed her first recording contract with Columbia on this date back in 1962, and this is a hat that she wore in Funny Girl.
Oh, serious.
Anybody wants to pass those around, we can get them going. And then, let's see. Put my poor son to work all the time. John, thanks. Get him started. In 1964, the San Francisco cable cars were declared a national landmark on this date. 1971, Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida opened, and it was the same date, October 1st, 1982, that Epcot Center opened in Florida. I brought Disney things before, but I wasn't sure if I brought the cell from Lady and the Tramp signed by Walt Disney. John, can I hand you that? Thanks. 1972, any hockey fans here? The first games of the World Hockey Association were played on this date. That was my birthday present during the Olympics. My wife gave me gave us tickets to watch the hockey semifinals up at the East Center, and that was a lot of fun. There had been the Canadians that won the women's hockey the day before, and we got some of the signatures from some of the players there, which was a fun event. On this date, October 1st of 1974, Watergate cover-up trial began in Washington, D.C. I brought a book signed by Nixon, Six Crises. Some of you remember this. Before he was elected president, he put this book out. And one of the books by one of the players, Bob Haldeman, was chief of staff during the Watergate years, is here. He went to prison, as did John Ehrlichman, you may remember, and some others. And then down below here, I don't know if you can see it, but this is a signed photograph from one of the great heavyweight boxing fights, the Thrilla in Manila, which took place on October 1st, 1975. How many of you remember that? I do. It's quite an event over in the Philippines. And if you're trying to make out how Joe Frazier signed, he signed Smokin' Joe Frazier. And Muhammad Ali signed his name on this. It's probably a little too big to pass around, but there it is. It went 15 rounds, and for the title match, and Muhammad Ali came out on top on that. I'm actually passing over a lot of these events. It's incredible what happened on this day. Pope John Paul II began his U.S. tour. Those of you that remember that, 1979. I mentioned Epcot opened in Florida on this date in '82. President Carter's Presidential Library was dedicated in Atlanta on October 1st. And Mikhail Gorbachev becomes President of the Soviet Union on this day. I've got a prayer book here that's signed by Muhammad Ali. I don't know if it's necessary to pass it around, but you can kind of see the signature from there. It's